Welcome to Shadow Fable, the place where the darkest tales come to life. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and prepare yourself for a chilling descent into the unknown. Tonight's story will haunt you long after you turn off the lights. Dr. Alan Weaver believed in control. Every movement of his scalpel was calculated, every decision precise. He had spent the last 17 years perfecting his craft, performing operations on the delicate, fragile web of the human brain. He had saved hundreds of lives, but no one remembers the ones you save. They only remember the ones you lose. And Alan had lost someone. The night it happened still played in his mind like a film reel, grainy, slow, and irreversible. The patient was a young woman, Lillian Graves, 29 years old. A routine cranial decompression. Simple, predictable. A procedure Alan had performed countless times, until something went wrong. 1 second, everything was normal. The heart monitor beeped in steady rhythm. The anesthesiologist watched her vitals with the passive confidence of someone expecting an ordinary outcome. The nurse handed Alan the cautery tool, her movements routine. And then the beeping stuttered. The room tilted. The world became a rush of voices. Her blood pressure dropped. The monitor screamed warnings. The nurses scrambled, moving with urgency, their voices overlapping in chaotic bursts of orders and numbers. "Suction!" Alan barked. "Get me!" He hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. A second where his mind, so accustomed to absolute confidence, froze. The numbers plummeted. Her skin paled. The heart monitor let out its final, long, piercing tone. Flatline. A silence fell over the room. A heavy, unforgiving silence. Alan stood there, the scalpel still in his hand, as the words came softly from the anesthesiologist. Time of death, 11:26 p.m. The world moved on. The hospital board ruled it an unforeseen complication, a tragic, unpreventable outcome. No one blamed Alan. No one questioned his skill. But he knew he had hesitated, and that hesitation had killed her. The first time he heard the whisper, he was alone in his office. It was late, long past visiting hours. The hallways were dark, empty except for the occasional flicker of fluorescent lights. The rhythmic hum of machines filled the space, blending into the quiet murmur of the hospital at rest. Alan sat at his desk, reviewing patient files when the whisper curled through the air. Soft, distant. Dr. Weaver. His pen froze mid-stroke. He turned sharply. The room was empty. A chill ran up his spine. He rubbed his temples, shaking his head. Lack of sleep, too much stress, it was nothing. But then it happened again. This time, closer. You hesitated. The whisper curled around his ear, slithering beneath his skin like ice water. Alan stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. His heart pounded. The silence in the room was suddenly too loud, the shadows in the corners stretching too far. He swallowed hard, running a hand over his face. He was imagining things. It was just his guilt. That's what he told himself. Until the operating room doors swung open on their own. The OR was empty. Alan stood in the dim glow of the emergency lights, his breath slow and uneven. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled his nostrils, mingling with something off, something rotten. The doors creaked as they settled back into place behind him. A breeze curled through the room, unnaturally cold. His gaze flicked to the surgical table. The sheets were pristine, untouched, except for the faint impression of a body, a shape, an outline, as if someone had just been lying there. Alan's pulse hammered in his throat. A faint scratching noise echoed through the room, a sound like metal against glass. His gaze drifted toward the instrument tray. A scalpel slid forward on its own. His breath caught. Then, in the reflection of the polished metal tray, a face, not his, not possible. Lillian. Her skin was pale, waxy. Her lips were parted, as if caught mid-scream. Her eyes, black and empty, stared directly at him. Alan stumbled back, knocking over the tray of instruments. The clatter rang through the OR, sharp, slicing through the silence. When he looked again, she was gone. The scalpel lay motionless on the floor. The room was still. Alan forced a breath into his lungs, dragging a shaking hand over his mouth. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But as he turned to leave, the whisper followed him. You hesitated. That night, Alan did not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the whisper slithered into his mind. You left me. You hesitated. You killed me, Alan. He tossed and turned, his sheets damp with sweat, the room too dark. At some point, exhaustion won. His breathing slowed, his mind slipping into uneasy, restless sleep. And then, the beeping. Faint at first, then louder. The sound of a heart monitor. Alan's eyes snapped open. He was not in his bedroom. He was in the OR, standing over a patient whose chest was not moving. His hands were covered in blood. The nurses were gone. The anesthesiologist was gone. The walls pulsed with a sickly green glow. And the body on the table. Lillian. Her eyes opened. She smiled. A grotesque, unnatural stretch of lips. Alan staggered back, his breath shuddering. This isn't real, he whispered. Lillian's head tilted, the sound of her neck cracking filling the empty room. Her mouth opened, and the hospital screamed. The walls shook. The heart monitor shrieked. The surgical lights flickered violently, casting shadows that moved on their own. And Lillian sat up, her fingers curled, reaching toward him. Come with me, doctor. Her voice was no longer a whisper. It was inside him. Alan could not move. His feet were rooted to the floor. Lillian stood, her hospital gown stained dark, her movements unnatural, jerky like a puppet on strings. Her lips parted. A soundless scream, then the lights exploded. Darkness swallowed the room, and the last thing Alan felt was her hands on his throat. Alan jerked awake, gasping for air. His body trembled, drenched in cold sweat. His sheets were tangled around him, twisted like restraints. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He was in his bedroom, not the hospital, not the OR, just his bedroom. His hands clutched at his throat, his skin burning where he swore he had felt her fingers. A dream. It was just a dream. But the faint rhythmic beeping still echoed in his ears, the sound of a heart monitor. His gaze flicked toward his nightstand, his phone, his alarm clock, his lamp. Nothing that should be making that noise. And yet, beep, beep, beep. The sound was coming from inside the walls, a static-filled, ghostly pulse, thumping in perfect mechanical rhythm. Alan staggered to his feet, his breath shaky, his mind struggling to ground itself. His apartment was silent. Too silent. He moved toward the hallway, every footstep impossibly loud against the hardwood floor. He reached the light switch. Flipped it. Nothing. The power was out. A sharp click echoed through the apartment. Then another, then another. Like footsteps. Like someone walking barefoot on tile. The sound came from the kitchen. Alan did not want to go in there. Every cell in his body screamed at him to turn around, to run. But something pulled him forward. Something familiar. Something inevitable. He stepped into the kitchen, his pulse drumming in his ears. And then, the refrigerator door stood wide open. The pale, flickering glow of the fridge light cast eerie shadows across the walls. His hands clenched at his sides. He had gone to bed alone. And yet, the door was open, and then he saw it. A small, neatly arranged pile of surgical tools. Scalpels, forceps, a bone saw, all lined up on the kitchen counter. A chill rippled through his spine. Then, beneath the hum of the fridge, came a whisper. You hesitated. Alan turned, his breath catching. And in the darkness of the hallway, she stood there, Lillian. Not in the hospital gown, not in the way he remembered. She was rotting. Her skin sagged, her lips cracked and peeling. Her eyes, black pits of endless, hungry void, bored into him. Her mouth twitched. And then she grinned. A slow, peeling stretch of lips, too wide, too unnatural. You let me die, doctor. The words slithered through the air, curling around his mind, sinking beneath his skin. Alan backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs. This isn't real, he whispered. Lillian took a step forward. Her bones cracked. Her fingers twitched, curling into rigid, claw-like points. Alan's back hit the counter. His hands clutched the cool edge of the sink. His gaze flicked to the scalpels. His tools, his weapons. But what was the use? You can't cut open a ghost. Lillian's head tilted, the movement sharp, unnatural. You don't look well, doctor. Her voice was inside his skull now, dripping with something ancient, something hungry. Maybe you should lie down. Alan's body moved on its own. His knees buckled, his vision blurred. His breath came shallow, like something was pulling it from him. He fell to the floor. Lillian followed, kneeling beside him, her fingers pressed against his throat. Software. Cold. Let me help you, doctor. She leaned in, her breath reeking of decay. Alan tried to scream, but the darkness swallowed him whole. They found him the next morning, slumped over his desk at the hospital, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. The official cause of death? Cardiac arrest. No trauma, no medical reason. But the security footage told a different story. At 3:14 a.m., the screen flickered. The lights dimmed. And just before Alan's body went still, a whisper crackled through the office speakers. You hesitated.